The road leading to the Hollowfields farm was not marked on any map. It was a strip of cracked pavement swallowed by encroaching weeds, a path that seemed to shift slightly each time it was traveled. Locals never spoke of it, and those who accidentally stumbled upon it rarely returned with the same look in their eyes. There were stories, of course, of a land that rejected the living, of a house that swallowed time, of a family that once owned it but was never seen again. Yet, despite its reputation, the farm remained, as if waiting. Elena Whitmore didn't believe in haunted places. She was a historian, trained in facts and figures, in dates that could be verified and accounts that could be cross-referenced. When her research led her to the Hollowfields, she saw an opportunity, an abandoned property with a history begging to be uncovered. The farm had belonged to the Callahan family, who vanished in 1956 without a trace. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just a house left exactly as it was, the dinner table still set, the bed still made. It was the kind of mystery that could make her career. She arrived late in the afternoon, her car rumbling to a stop in front of the rusted gate. The air smelled of damp earth, and something metallic, something faintly wrong. The farmhouse loomed ahead, a skeletal structure with peeling paint and windows like vacant eyes. Beyond it, fields of withered corn stretched into the horizon, their stalks bent as though whispering among themselves. The wind blew, but the corn did not move. Elena stepped out of her car, her boots crunching against the gravel. She took a deep breath and pushed the gate open. It groaned, the sound unnervingly human. The porch stairs creaked under her weight, the wood damp and swollen from years of neglect. She placed her hand on the doorknob, half expecting it to resist, but it turned easily, as if the house had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something older. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling. Furniture sat draped in sheets like forgotten ghosts. But what struck Elena most was the silence. It was not the silence of an empty house, but something deeper, a silence that pressed against her, listening. She moved carefully, her fingers brushing over the wooden walls, feeling the grooves of carvings she couldn't quite make out. The Callahans had left in the middle of their lives, but the house had not forgotten them. She moved toward the kitchen, her boots clicking against the hardwood floor. The table was still set, plates filled with dust, glasses clouded with age. A single chair was pulled slightly back, as if someone had just risen from it. Her fingers grazed a silver fork, and in that moment, a sound shattered the silence, the distant creak of a door. Elena spun around, heart pounding. The sound had come from the second floor. She hadn't left any doors open. Her rational mind told her it was the wind, that old houses groaned under their own weight. But another part of her, some instinct buried deep, told her she was wrong. Swallowing hard, she moved toward the staircase, her hand gripping the wooden railing. As she ascended, the temperature dropped. The walls narrowed. The air felt heavier, thick with something she couldn't name. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched into darkness, doors lining either side. One door at the end was slightly ajar, swinging gently as though someone had just passed through. Elena hesitated. Her breath was shallow, her skin cold. Every rational part of her screamed to turn back, but something pulled her forward, a historian's curiosity, a need to understand. She reached for the door and pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a single mirror standing against the far wall. Its surface was clouded, its frame warped as if touched by fire. But as Elena stepped closer, her reflection did not move in sync with her. It lingered, watching before tilting its head to one side, just slightly, just enough to show that whatever was in that mirror was not her. The silence deepened, and then the reflection smiled. Elena did not scream. Every muscle in her body locked in place as she stared at the reflection, at the thing wearing her face but not quite fitting into it. The smile it gave her was wrong, too wide, too knowing. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she stepped backward, the old wooden floor groaning beneath her weight. The reflection did not mimic her movement. Instead, it leaned forward, its grin widening. A pulse of cold air swept through the room, rattling the window panes. The mirror's surface rippled, like a pond disturbed by a stone, and for a brief moment, Elena saw something beneath the glass, a landscape she did not recognize. Black fields stretched into an empty sky, and figures moved within them, their bodies shifting like they were made of liquid shadow. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the vision was gone. The reflection was normal again, or at least as normal as it could pretend to be. Elena tore her gaze away, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was a trick of the light, a trick of her mind. She turned away from the mirror and forced herself to move, her boots heavy against the dust-covered floor. She needed air. She needed to leave the room, the house, maybe even the farm itself. But as she stepped into the hallway, the floor beneath her feet changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the texture like walking over loose earth instead of solid wood. Then, with a sickening realization, she understood. This part of the hallway was sagging slightly, as if something underneath had shifted, as if something beneath the house was moving. Elena hesitated. The house had been abandoned for decades. The foundation could be rotting, the ground underneath unsettled by time. But deep in her gut, she knew this wasn't erosion or decay. This was something else. Slowly, she crouched down, pressing her palm flat against the floorboards. They felt warm, almost feverish. And then, beneath her hand, she felt it, a slow, deliberate thump. A heartbeat. Her stomach clenched. She pulled her hand back and forced herself to stand, pushing away the sudden dizziness that washed over her. This house was not just old. It was alive in a way that defied everything she understood. And worse, it was aware of her. Elena stumbled down the stairs, each step feeling heavier, like the house was reluctant to let her go. She reached the front door, grabbed the handle, and twisted. It didn't budge. She yanked it harder. Nothing. The door was locked, though she had never locked it. A sound drifted from the kitchen, the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. The breath caught in her throat. The table had been untouched when she arrived, the dinner plates coated in dust. But as she stepped cautiously toward the kitchen doorway, she saw it. The chair that had been slightly pulled back was now tucked neatly against the table. The dust on the plates was gone, and the fork she had touched earlier was missing. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Not from the front door, not from the windows. It came from beneath her, from the floorboards at her feet. Elena staggered back, her chest tightening. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. She had read about haunted places, written about them even, but those were stories. Explanations wrapped in folklore and exaggeration. But now, standing in the center of a house that should have been empty, she could feel it. The house was breathing. The farm was watching. And something beneath the soil wanted her to know it was there. Then the knocking stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and expectant. And just as she took another step back, the floor beneath her cracked. The wood splintered open like brittle bones, and before she could react, Elena was falling. Down into the darkness beneath the house. Elena hit the ground hard. The air rushed from her lungs, leaving her gasping in the darkness. Dirt and splintered wood rained down around her, settling in her hair and clinging to her skin. For a moment, she lay there, disoriented, trying to process what had happened. She had fallen through the floor of an abandoned house into a space that shouldn't have existed. Slowly, she pushed herself up, wincing as pain flared through her shoulder. The ground beneath her was soft, damp, not the stone foundation she had expected, but something else entirely. Her fingers curled into the earth, and it was warm, like fresh-turned soil in the heat of summer. Except there was no heat here. The air was thick and cold, carrying a scent that was both familiar and foreign. Damp wood, rotting leaves, and something faintly metallic. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The hole she had fallen through gaped above her, a jagged wound in the ceiling, allowing just enough light to cast long, twisting shadows against the dirt walls. This was not a basement. There were no wooden beams, no signs of construction. It was a cavern, a space hollowed out by something other than human hands. A shiver crawled up her spine. The walls were uneven, marked with strange, shallow grooves. She reached out and traced one with her fingertips. It was not the scratch of an animal or the accidental scrape of digging tools. It was deliberate, a carving, a symbol. She stepped back, scanning the walls, her pulse quickening. More symbols, dozens of them, etched into the dirt like a language she could not read. Some spiraled inward, some stretched like reaching fingers. And all of them, every single one, pointed downward. A noise broke the silence. Not a creak, not a groan of settling wood, but a whisper, a dry, papery sound, as though the very walls were exhaling. Elena froze, her breath tight in her throat. The sound wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from below her. She took a step back, her boots sinking slightly into the soil. Another whisper, closer this time. Her heart pounded. There was something underneath her. Elena turned, scanning for any way out. The walls curved around her, enclosing the space like a womb. The only exit was the hole above, too high to reach. Panic threatened to claw its way up her throat, but she forced it down. Think. There had to be a way up, a way out. She took a deep breath and crouched, her fingers searching the ground. The soil was loose. Too loose. As if it had been disturbed recently. Her nails scraped against something hard, something smooth. She hesitated, then dug deeper. A bone. It was small, pale, human. A finger. Elena jerked her hand back, scrambling away. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as realization hit her. This wasn't just a hidden space beneath the house. It was a grave. And as she stared at the loose soil shifting under her feet, she realized whatever had been buried here wasn't resting anymore. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps as she staggered backward, her boots sinking into the loose soil. The pale bone glared at her from the dirt, an obscene relic of something long forgotten or something intentionally hidden. She wiped her trembling hands against her jeans, as if she could cleanse herself of the unease creeping through her veins. The whispering had stopped, but silence offered no comfort. It pressed against her ears, thick and unnatural, like the hush before a predator strikes. She turned, desperate for any sign of an exit, her gaze flicking between the hole above and the walls around her. The symbols, those strange, curving etchings, seemed deeper now, as though they had grown overnight, stretching into the dirt like veins. Elena's mind raced. If this was a burial site, how many bodies lay beneath her? And who, or what, had put them here? A cemetery would have been marked, recorded, respected. This was different. This was hidden. A breeze, impossibly cold for an underground chamber, brushed against the back of her neck. She spun around. There was nothing, just the same uneven walls, the same eerie markings. But the air had changed. It carried a scent that hadn't been there before, something sharp like damp iron. Blood. Then the ground shifted. It was a subtle movement at first, like the earth was settling beneath her weight. But then it swelled, rolling under her feet like the belly of a breathing beast. The whispering returned, this time closer, curling around her ears like a lover's secret. She stumbled, her hands catching against the dirt, but the ground didn't hold firm. It opened. With a sickening squelch, the soil split apart beneath her fingers, revealing something beneath the surface. At first, it looked like roots, thick, gnarled things twisting in the darkness. But roots didn't move. Roots didn't twitch. Elena recoiled as the tendrils stretched, coiling out of the dirt with a slow, deliberate hunger. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language she could not understand, filling her head with a dull, thrumming pressure. The tendrils weren't roots. They were fingers. From beneath the soil, something was rising. Elena scrambled to her feet, her pulse hammering. The thing beneath her shifted again, pulling itself upward. The fingers, long and wrong, pushed through the dirt like they were crawling. Then something else surfaced, a face. Not fully formed, not flesh and bone, but something trying to be. It pulsed beneath the dirt like a fetus in a womb, its mouth moving in soundless murmurs, its eye sockets empty voids. And yet, it saw her. Elena did not scream. She ran. Her hands clawed at the walls, searching for anything to grip, anything to climb. The hole above seemed impossibly far, but she had to reach it. She had to get out. The whispering voices turned to wails, shrieking in agony or warning. The thing in the dirt pulled itself higher, its incomplete body writhing free from the soil. Elena leaped, her fingers catching the jagged edge of the hole. Pain shot through her arms, but she held on. She kicked against the wall, scrabbling for purchase, ignoring the skin peeling from her palms as she hauled herself upward. The thing below screeched, a noise that did not belong to this world. Its malformed limbs thrashed, clawing at the air as she pulled herself over the edge. She tumbled onto the wooden floor of the house, gasping, her vision swimming. The whispering had stopped. The shrieking had stopped. But as she turned to look back into the hole, there was nothing. The dirt was smooth again, untouched, as if nothing had ever been there, except for one thing, a single, pale handprint in the center of the floor. Elena lay on the wooden floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her body trembled, her arms screaming from the desperate climb, but the pain was secondary. What she had seen, what had tried to crawl from the ground, was now burned into her mind, an image that refused to fade. The handprint on the floor was stark against the dust, pale and unsettlingly perfect, like a ghost had pressed its fingers into the wood. She stared at it, half expecting the print to move, to twitch, to spread as if the fingers would curl toward her. But it remained still. That didn't make it any less terrifying. Pushing herself up, she staggered to her feet, eyes darting between the hole in the floor and the doorway beyond. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to get out, to never look back. But something about the silence in the house had changed. It was heavier now, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. She turned toward the exit, but the moment she took a step, something shifted. Not in the hole below, not in the ground, but in the house. The wooden planks groaned, a slow, aching sound like old bones bending. The walls seemed closer, the shadows stretching in ways they shouldn't. The air chilled. A presence filled the room. Elena's breath caught. She wasn't alone. A faint creak echoed from behind her. She spun around, her pulse hammering. But there was nothing, just the empty room, the broken furniture, and the gaping hole in the floor. Yet, the feeling remained, the knowledge that something was here with her. She moved cautiously, her eyes sweeping the corners, the doorway, the ceiling. The silence deepened, so absolute it rang in her ears. She swallowed hard, every instinct screaming that she was being watched. And then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the hallway beyond the room, where the darkness was thickest. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, knock, 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 as if something just out of sight was waiting for an answer. Elena's hands curled into fists. Every muscle in her body was tight, her heartbeat erratic. She should run. She should tear through the front door and never look back. But something in the air held her in place, something wrong. She stepped forward. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, its walls warped and shifting in the dim light. The tapping had stopped, replaced by something worse breathing. Slow, steady inhalations, as if the house itself had lungs. Drawing in the air, she exhaled. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply, but there was nothing. Another flicker, closer this time. Elena's breath hitched. The walls seemed to ripple. The shadows in the corners stretched, shifting as though something unseen was moving just beyond them. And then a whisper, not the disembodied murmurs from the hole below. This was different. It was right next to her ear. "You shouldn't be here." The words weren't spoken. They were exhaled, a breath of ice against her skin. Elena bolted. She ran through the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground, arms slamming against the walls as she stumbled through the narrow space. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in tongues, their syllables broken and wrong. She burst through the front door, the cold night air slapping her in the face. She didn't stop, not when she reached the porch, not when her boots hit the dirt path leading away from the house, not until she was deep into the woods. Only then did she dare to look back. The house loomed in the distance, its rotting frame silhouetted against the night. The windows stared like empty eyes, black and hollow, but something moved within them. A shape, a shadow, and then the house was gone. One blink, and it simply wasn't there anymore. The clearing where it had stood was now nothing but overgrown weeds, the earth undisturbed. No rotting porch, no broken windows, no hole in the floor. Elena's stomach twisted. She took a step forward, but the moment she did, a sound echoed through the night. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, coming from the empty space where the house had been. Elena stood frozen in the damp grass, her breath uneven. The house, the thing she had just escaped from, was gone, swallowed by the night as if it had never been there. But the sound remained. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, hammering through the emptiness where walls should have been. She wanted to believe it was her mind playing tricks on her, that the terror had warped her senses. But the cold against her skin felt real. The scent of damp earth was sharp in her nose. The sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears was unmistakable. This was happening. Swallowing hard, she took a hesitant step forward. The ground where the house had stood was undisturbed. No foundation, no broken planks, not even a trace of dust displaced by her frantic escape. But then, just beyond the spot where the front door should have been, she saw it. A single, wooden door frame. It stood alone in the clearing, untouched by time. No walls, no structure to support it. Just an arch of splintered wood standing upright, as though it had been cut from reality and left behind like a forgotten relic. And on it, in streaks of dark red, were handprints. Elena shuddered. The prints were erratic, some small, others large, fingers splayed wide as if clawing to get through. Some were smudged, as if they had been dragged across the surface in desperation. She should turn away, leave, run, but her body didn't listen. Instead, she stepped closer. The knocks came again, this time from the other side of the doorframe. Elena's stomach clenched. There was nothing beyond it but open air, but the sound was real, vibrating through the wood. Something was there, something unseen. A cold wind swept through the clearing, stirring the tall grass. The handprints on the frame seemed to darken, as if freshly marked. Then, beneath the knocking, she heard it, a murmur. A voice just barely audible, speaking in a breathless whisper. She strained to make out the words, but the wind swallowed them, twisting them into something unintelligible. Then, the whisper stopped. A click. Elena barely had time to react before the doorframe swung open. It wasn't supposed to move. There was no door attached to it, just the frame. But as she watched, an invisible hinge turned, revealing a doorway into something else. The air beyond the frame shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt, warping the world within it. At first, she saw nothing, just darkness. Then, faintly a room formed. It wasn't the house. It was something deeper, older. Wooden floors stretched into shadows, walls lined with something she couldn't quite make out. Shapes moved in the gloom, slow and deliberate, their outlines shifting as if caught between realities. And then she saw it, a figure. It stood just beyond the threshold, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. It was a human, not exactly. Its limbs were too long, its stance too rigid. And when it moved, oh God, when it moved, it did so in a way that defied logic, jerking forward and snapping back like a glitching image in an old film. Elena stumbled backward. The figure didn't chase her. It just stood there, unmoving, head tilting as if it was studying her in return. Then, in a single, unnatural motion, it raised one hand, pale, skeletal fingers curling into a fist. And it knocked 3 times. This time, the sound wasn't distant. It wasn't from an illusion. It was right against her chest. Elena choked on a scream as a force slammed into her, knocking her off her feet. The world spun, the sky and ground flipping, and when she hit the earth, the breath was ripped from her lungs. She gasped, rolling onto her hands and knees. The air around her was wrong, heavier. The trees that had once surrounded the clearing were now twisted, their trunks gaping like mouths. And the doorframe? Gone. But something had changed. The land fell off, as if the rules of reality had shifted in her absence. The night was too still. The stars above no longer flickered. And in the distance, where the farmhouse had once stood, a new structure loomed. A barn, and from within it, the slow, deliberate sound of knocking. Elena's pulse hammered in her throat as she staggered to her feet. The barn stood where there had been nothing before, its warped wooden frame rising against the moonlit sky. The structure was old, impossibly old, with beams twisted like sinew and a sagging roof that pulsed slightly, as if breathing. She didn't want to go near it. Every cell in her body screamed to turn around, to flee, to escape this place that had defied reality itself. But something deep inside her, something primal, knew that turning her back would be worse. The knocking came again. Slow, measured, waiting. She swallowed hard. The world around her had already shifted once, bending like a dream, unraveling at the seams. If she didn't confront whatever was inside that barn, would it shift again? Would she wake up somewhere even worse? Step by step, she moved forward. The air grew thicker the closer she got, warmer, as though something inside was breathing heat into the night. The scent of burnt wood and damp earth filled her nostrils. The door to the barn was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness bleeding into the moonlight. Elena hesitated, her fingers hovering near the rough wood. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened. At first, only silence. Then, beneath the stillness, a faint sound, a rustling, a shuffle, a whisper. Not words, just movement. She pushed the door open. The inside of the barn was vast, far larger than it should have been. The ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. Stalls lined the walls, but they weren't for livestock. The spaces were too narrow, the bars too thick. Some were empty, others held shapes, hunched and wrong, shifting in the gloom. Elena took a step inside. The floor groaned beneath her, the sound rippling outward like a warning. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. And then the knocking came again, not from the walls, not from the stalls, from above. Slowly, dreadfully, she tilted her head up. At first she saw nothing, just rafters stretching endlessly into the void. But then something moved. A figure crawled along the beams, head turned unnaturally downward, limbs jerking in a way that defied anatomy. Its skin was stretched too tight, pale and almost translucent in the moonlight filtering through the broken slats in the roof. Its fingers, long, curling, reaching, drummed against the wood. It was watching her. Elena's breath hitched. The thing above her tilted its head, and for the first time, she saw its face, or what was left of it. Its mouth was sewn shut, and yet it was still whispering. The sound grew louder, buzzing like flies, filling the cavernous space of the barn. The figures in the stalls began to shift, pressing closer to the bars, their sunken eyes reflecting slivers of light. The whispering turned to words, a voice, dry and brittle, like wind scraping against bone. She let them in. The barn lurched. The walls flexed, the ceiling stretched, the stalls groaned like something was pushing against them from the other side. The air thickened, pressing against Elena's chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, the barn doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the barn whole. Elena spun toward the doors, her breath ragged, her hands outstretched to where the exit had been just moments before. But there was nothing, only an expanse of shadow, so thick it felt alive. The wood beneath her feet no longer creaked. Instead, it shifted a slow, pulsing motion like something breathing beneath the floorboards. Behind her, the whispering continued. She let them in. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It had the weight of something ancient, something that had existed before language had names for horrors like this. Elena clenched her fists, grounding herself in the sensation of her own nails digging into her palms. She wasn't dreaming. The barn was real. The thing in the rafters was real. In the whispering, she turned, her stomach lurching as her eyes adjusted to the dark. The stalls that had been occupied were now empty. The bars that had held those hunched, shifting figures were open, bent outward, as if something had forced its way free. The air had changed too. It was thick with a smell she couldn't quite place. Not rot, not mildew, but something damp and wrong. something that made her throat tighten and her vision blur. Then a sound. Not the whispering, not the knocking, something dragging. Elena's body locked up, every nerve screaming as the sound slithered through the darkness, coming from the farthest corner of the barn. It was slow, deliberate, like something testing the ground, feeling its way toward her. She swallowed against the dry tightness in her throat, forcing herself to take a step back. Her foot caught on something. She looked down. There was nothing there, and yet her body felt it, a shape solid and cold beneath her foot, as if she had stepped on a hand reaching from the floor. But when she moved, the sensation vanished. No sound, no impact, just the weight of something that should have been there, but wasn't. Her pulse pounded. The dragging sound grew louder. Elena's instinct screamed at her to run, to move. But where? The doors were gone, the barn itself shifting like a living thing, and the whispering hadn't stopped. She turned again, squinting into the dark, searching for a way out, for anything that would make sense of this nightmare. Then, something cold brushed against her arm. She flinched, spinning wildly, arms out to protect herself, but again, nothing. Her breath came in short gasps now, panic taking hold. She had to think. She had to. A hand clamped around her ankle. Elena barely had time to scream before she was yanked off her feet. Elena hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs as something cold and unseen yanked her backward. Her fingers clawed at the wooden planks beneath her, splinters embedding in her skin, but the force was relentless, dragging her toward the dark abyss at the back of the barn. She twisted, kicking wildly, but her foot met only emptiness. There was nothing there, no grip, no fingers, no body. And yet, she was being pulled with an unwavering force, as if the barn itself had reached out and claimed her. A guttural, choking noise filled the air. At first, she thought it was her own strangled breath, but no, it was coming from the shadows, from all around her. A chorus of rasping, clicking breaths, rising and falling in an unnatural rhythm. The barn was breathing her in. Elena reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around her phone. She fumbled to turn on the flashlight, her hand shaking as the beam of light slashed through the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing, and then something shifted. The floorboards ahead of her buckled and cracked, revealing a gap that hadn't been there before. The dragging force intensified, pulling her toward it. Below, the space wasn't empty. It was deep, impossibly deep. Inside, she saw things moving. Not people, not animals. Shapes. Writhing, shifting shadows with no definite form. Their bodies stretching and twisting like reflections in rippling water. Their faces, if they had any, were lost in the abyss, but their eyes, hollow and endless, locked onto her. The whispers returned, stronger this time, overlapping, merging into a single, monstrous voice. She let them in. She let them in. She let them in. Elena screamed, her free hand latching onto a support beam. The unseen grip on her ankle tightened, jerking her closer to the chasm. A slithering mass of something reached up from below, its shape constantly shifting, tendrils of darkness stretching toward her. With a desperate cry, she kicked again, her heels smashing against something solid, an impact that shouldn't have been possible. The force of the strike sent a jolt up her leg, but the grip loosened, just enough for her to wrench herself free. She scrambled backward, gasping, the flashlight shaking in her trembling grip. The hole in the floor began to close, the warped planks snapping back into place like a wound healing over. The barn lurched, the whispers stopped, and then silence. Elena lay on the ground, her chest heaving, sweat dripping down her forehead. The barn looked exactly as it had before. The stalls were still empty. The rafters still stretched impossibly high. The doors still gone, but something had changed. She wasn't alone anymore. A single, chilling sound broke the silence. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward her. The footsteps were unmistakable. They were not the casual shuffle of a human, nor the chaotic scramble of a desperate animal. They were slow, calculated, almost deliberate, each footfall falling with an eerie precision. The sound resonated through the barn, filling every corner, every empty stall, every shadow. It was as though the barn itself were alive, breathing in time with the steps. Elena remained motionless, her body pressed flat against the cold, rough floorboards. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything but the rhythm of the footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. She dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly, as if the very act of existence might draw whatever was approaching closer. Her hand still gripped the phone, the faint glow from the flashlight cutting through the darkness like a frail beacon. And then it stopped. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, Elena thought it was over. Maybe the footsteps had belonged to nothing more than the barn's strange energy, a trick of the mind, a manifestation of her fear. But that hope, that fleeting glimpse of relief, was immediately shattered. From the blackness ahead of her, a pair of eyes blinked into existence. At first, it was nothing but a glint, a flicker of light reflecting off the deep, hollow sockets. But as her gaze locked onto them, the eyes began to grow, widening slowly, their pupils expanding into infinite voids. The light from the flashlight barely illuminated them, yet their presence filled the space like a shadow that refused to retreat. The eyes were perfectly still, like two orbs suspended in the air, floating in front of her. They were utterly impossible, yet undeniably real. Elena's heart skipped in her chest. She could feel them watching her, not just seeing her, but piercing her, invading every thought, every fear, every hidden corner of her mind. There was nothing comforting in those eyes, nothing human. They were ancient, old as the earth itself, and they knew things. She wanted to look away, to flee, to curl up and disappear into the floor beneath her. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed, caught in their gaze as if some unseen force had rooted her to the barn's floor. Time stretched, warped. Seconds felt like hours. Her breath was shallow, panicked, but still, she could not look away. Then, the voice returned. It was not the same whispering voice from before. This was more direct, more commanding, and it echoed, not just in her ears, but deep within her chest, as though the words had been carved into the very air around her. "You should not have come." The words twisted in her mind, forcing their meaning through layers of fear. She shouldn't have come. That was it, wasn't it? She had known deep down that this place, this barn, was not meant for anyone. It was a tomb for something ancient, something that had waited long for someone to set foot inside, to disturb its slumber. Elena wasn't supposed to be here. The eyes blinked again, and with that blink, something else appeared. From the darkness beyond the eyes, figures began to materialize, shapes moving slowly, creeping toward her like shadows made flesh. They were the same as the ones she had seen earlier in the stalls, the hunched forms, their limbs distorted, their faces hidden. But their eyes, those eyes, they were all the same. Empty, hollow, endless voids, reflecting nothing but the blackness around them. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to suffocate the air, to fill every inch of the barn with an inescapable weight. Elena's chest felt tight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't cry out. The barn had swallowed her, and whatever these creatures were, they were the ones who owned it now. The eyes were closer now. She could feel their gaze on her skin, crawling beneath her clothes, burrowing into her very bones. And as the figures closed in around her, their eyes all blinking at once, the barn shifted again. Walls closing in, the ceiling lowering, the floor tightening beneath her feet. The barn was becoming smaller, shrinking, as though it were pressing in on her. The space was no longer a space. It was an entity, a living, breathing thing that wanted nothing more than to crush her into nothing. And yet, amidst the darkness, amidst the endless eyes and the growing weight, Elena realized something. She had to move. She had to escape. Because whatever they were, whatever this place had become, it wasn't the end. Not yet. Elena's breath was ragged, a desperate rhythm that seemed to echo in the claustrophobic confines of the barn. The walls, the very air, seemed to pulse around her. It wasn't just the oppressive darkness closing in. It was the sensation that the barn itself had become aware of her presence. Every step she took, every movement, felt as though the walls were listening, watching, weighing her actions with an unseen, malevolent intelligence. It was as if the barn had come alive, not just in a metaphysical sense, but physically, as if every nail in the wood, every rusted hinge, every creaking floorboard had grown sentient. The barn wasn't merely a structure. It was a creature in its own right, an ancient being feeding off her fear. The eyes, those terrible, infinite orbs, had not blinked again. They hovered at the periphery of her vision, and though they were still, Elena could feel them, always there, pressing into the very core of her being. They were waiting for her to move, waiting for the right moment to strike. But even as she fought the paralysis consuming her, something more insidious began to stir beneath her skin. She could feel the tremor in her fingertips, the cold that now seeped into her bones. The barn shadows seemed to twist, to move with a purpose that was far too intelligent to be coincidence. There was something pulling at her, urging her to go deeper into the heart of the barn, urging her to reach out, to interact with whatever lay hidden beneath. Her mind raced. She had to find an escape. She had to break free. But each step she took was measured, like walking through quicksand. The barn, it seemed, was trying to absorb her, its walls tightening, its floor shifting beneath her feet, pulling at her with an almost physical strength. And with every shift, she could feel the eyes growing closer, as if the very darkness around her was being molded to contain her. The barn was a trap. The walls themselves, once benign and sturdy, had become the cages of something older, something that had no use for the living. They weren't just keeping her inside, they were pressing her down, suffocating her, warping the space to become her prison. And then a whisper, soft but undeniable, slipped into her mind. It wasn't the same as the voice that had spoken before, a guttural growl or whispering chant that filled the barn. This was a voice, clear and hissing, like a serpent's breath, curling around the edges of her thoughts. The words were unformed at first, nothing more than fragments, like the remnants of a language long forgotten. She will come. She will join us. Elena's stomach dropped. She knew what it meant, even though she didn't want to acknowledge it. The barn wasn't just alive. It was an entity, an ancient force that had claimed everything that had dared to enter it, twisted them into something else, something it could feed on. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was becoming part of it. And as the whispering voice continued to churn in her mind, Elena felt her feet begin to move. It was subtle at first, an involuntary action, like her body was no longer her own. But the more she fought against it, the more the walls seemed to squeeze, urging her forward. The darkness was pulling her again, but this time, it wasn't just the barn. It was something else inside her, something she could feel crawling through her veins, consuming her. She had heard stories of cursed places, haunted houses, and the way their very architecture could wrap itself around a person's soul. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. This wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a living thing, and it was hungry. The barn had ears, and they were listening. Elena stumbled forward, her feet moving of their own accord, as if some invisible force were guiding her deeper into the bowels of the barn. The walls, which had once seemed static and reliable, now pulsed with a sinister energy, shifting in rhythm with her every step. The barn was no longer just a place. Its presence had grown into something almost tangible, a physical force that demanded her attention, as if the building itself had taken on a mind of its own. The whispering had stopped, but its echo remained, reverberating through the dark corners of her mind. The voice, now distant but still faintly present, had changed. It was no longer the hissing serpent of before, but something more smooth, more sophisticated. It felt closer, like a breath on the back of her neck, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but the deep, suffocating darkness. The barn was alive, that much was certain. But it was no longer enough to simply exist within its walls. Now, Elena understood with a sickening clarity that the barn was manipulating her. The walls were not simply surrounding her. They were shaping her experience. Her actions were no longer her own. She was being led, controlled. The space was warping, guiding her with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. She tried to shake the thought, to remind herself that she was still in control, that she had to fight. But as her hands brushed against the barn's cold, rough timbers, she realized how futile her resistance had become. The more she moved, the more she felt the pull, the gentle pressure of an unseen hand nudging her forward, urging her into the heart of the barn. There was no escaping it. The barn knew exactly where it wanted her, and it was determined to have her there. Her breath quickened as she reached the center of the barn, an open space where the air felt even heavier, thicker. There was no light, no source of warmth, just the overwhelming weight of emptiness pressing in from all sides. In the center of the room, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A dark shape, hunched low to the ground, its outline barely perceptible in the near-total darkness. It was no ordinary object. It was an altar made of gnarled, twisted wood, its shape unnatural, almost like the barn itself had grown it as part of its own twisted anatomy. And on top of the altar lay an object that chilled Elena to her core. A book, old, weathered, its pages yellowed and brittle. Yet somehow, it radiated an unnatural energy, a presence that reached out to her like an old, forgotten memory. The book called to her. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The urge to reach out, to touch the book, was overwhelming. It was like an instinct, a primal compulsion she couldn't resist. Something in the air had shifted. The walls were no longer just walls. They were closing in, and the book was now the focal point, the heart of this twisting maze. Elena felt her fingers twitch, her body yearning to approach the altar. "You have come this far," the voice whispered again, smooth as silk. "Now, you must see the truth." The truth. What did it mean? Was it talking about the book? About the barn? Or something more? Elena's mind raced as she stepped forward, her body moving with a will of its own. Not entirely hers, but not entirely foreign either. Her hand reached for the book, and as her fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, filling her with an immediate sense of dread and understanding. It was as if the book itself had become alive, as though it had awakened to her touch. The air around her seemed to thicken, the shadows swirling and shifting in a frantic dance, the barn vibrating with the tension of something about to break free. A rush of cold air blew from the altar, sending a shiver down Elena's spine. She felt the walls, the very bones of the barn, tremble as if they were aware of the impending release. The book was no longer a passive object. It was part of the force that had shaped the barn, part of the living presence that had drawn Elena here. She had touched it, and now she understood. She understood that this place, this barn, was not just a haunted structure. It was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and the entities trapped within it had waited for someone like her to come along, to disturb the ancient rituals hidden in its depths. And in that moment, Elena realized with a sickening certainty that there was no turning back. The barn had chosen her. She was no longer an outsider, a trespasser. It was too late for that. She had become part of its ritual, part of the twisted force that had shaped it. The walls had ears, yes, but they also had eyes, and they were all watching her now. The moment Elena touched the book, everything shifted. The barn, once a decaying, forgotten space, now seemed to breathe around her. The air became thick, almost tangible, clinging to her skin as if the very atmosphere of the place had absorbed something dark, something ancient, and now it was pulsing with life. The barn itself seemed to wake from a long slumber, the walls creaking and groaning as if stretching after an eternal stillness. It was as though it had been waiting for her, for this exact moment, when she would cross the threshold into whatever realm it had long been guarding. The book under her fingers was alive in a way that no object should be. As she held it, its pages rustled, though there was no wind. The writing on the pages shimmered, as if alive and shifting, words that had long been buried now rising to the surface. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as the sensation of the book began to seep into her mind. The words, once unintelligible, now whispered in dark, incomprehensible tongues, each syllable more chilling than the last. The whispers were not coming from the book itself, though. They were coming from within her, slipping into her mind like foreign thoughts, memories that weren't hers. Elena's pulse quickened. She felt the sensation of hands, cold and invisible, pressing against her skin, her face, as if trying to pull her into the dark history woven into the barn's very fabric. She was no longer just an observer of this place. She was being drawn in, pulled into a deeper layer of its cursed reality. The air grew colder still, and Elena's breath became visible in the dim light. As she stood frozen, holding the book, her thoughts began to fragment. Images flashed before her eyes, flashes of previous inhabitants, shadows of figures long forgotten. She saw faces, not human but twisted, their features obscured by darkness and hunger. The barn had been a home to countless souls before hers, each one consumed by the place. She saw their eyes, empty, staring, imploring for release. Yet, there was no escape. They had become part of the barn. And now, Elena understood. The same fate awaited her if she didn't break free. With a gasp, Elena jerked her hand away from the book. Her body trembled with the shock of the vision, her skin crawling as though it had been touched by something otherworldly. But as her hand left the book, the barn seemed to lurch, like a breath held too long before being exhaled. The darkness swirled violently, the shadows tightening around her, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. In the center of the barn, the altar seemed to grow, expanding into the floor, the ceiling, taking on an even more monstrous shape. Elena could feel its power rising, thrumming like a heartbeat. It was as though she had unlocked something, a passage to a world that should not have been disturbed. The book had opened a door, but not just one to knowledge. It had opened a door to the barn's true nature, to the creatures it had been keeping at bay for centuries. And now, that door was wide open, and Elena was its key. The barn felt alive again, but now it was more than just a living structure. It was a predator, feeding off the fear and despair of its victims. Its energy had a hunger to it, a primal force that could consume the souls of anyone trapped within its walls. Elena's breathing grew shallow, the pressure in the air becoming unbearable. She felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her, draining her of every ounce of strength she had. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. Every breath felt like a labor, each one a struggle to stay alive. The barn's grip on her mind was tightening, and with each passing second, Elena could feel herself slipping further into its grasp. But as the weight of the barn pressed down on her, something inside her snapped. A surge of defiance, an ancient survival instinct, flared to life. She couldn't give up. Not yet. She had to escape, to find some way to break the cycle of suffering that this place demanded. In a final, desperate act, Elena closed her eyes and let the book fall from her hands. It hit the floor with a sickening thud, but its power still lingered in the air. For a moment, the barn seemed to still, as if uncertain of her next move. Elena took a shaky breath, gathering her remaining strength. She had touched the book, yes, but that didn't mean she had to accept what it offered. The darkness could consume her, or she could fight, break free, and let the barn know that she wouldn't be its next victim. As the world around her pulsed with ominous energy, Elena took a step back, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She had one choice: to destroy whatever held the barn alive, or to become a part of it forever. Elena stood motionless, her pulse reverberating in her ears. The darkness in the barn had become a living thing, pulsing with an ominous rhythm that seemed to echo her own heartbeat. She had felt the weight of the barn's power press against her, suffocating her thoughts, drowning her in a sea of ancient fear. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering her name, calling her to become one with the lost souls that roamed its cursed halls. But despite the suffocating terror surrounding her, something deep inside Elena refused to yield. Resistance had always been part of her nature. It had propelled her through years of hardship, through all the grief, and through all the challenges that life had thrown at her. Now, in this dark and decaying barn, it was that same resilience that would be her saving grace. But the question remained, could she destroy the evil that had taken root here? Or would she be consumed, like so many others before her? The altar at the center of the barn had become the focal point of her attention. It seemed to grow in the dim light, its grotesque shape more sinister than ever. It was the epicenter of this nightmare, the anchor for the malevolent forces that haunted the place. The whispers were growing louder now, urging her to approach it, to accept what it offered. But Elena knew better. She had to disrupt the power. She had to find a way to sever the connection between the barn and the creatures that lurked in its shadow. Her gaze fell back to the book on the floor. It lay there, still and silent. Yet its energy lingered in the air, almost tangible, like a pulse vibrating through her bones. She knew now that it was no ordinary book. It was a portal, a conduit for something far older, far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The mere act of touching it had unleashed its fury, had opened a gateway that had been closed for centuries. And now that it had been opened, the forces trapped within it were awake, eager to break free. Elena's mind raced. She could sense the dread that hung in the air, but she also felt something else, an inexplicable force, an ancient energy that seemed to hum beneath her skin. There was a connection between her and the barn, something that went beyond mere chance. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though her presence here was no accident. The book had chosen her, and now the barn had its claws in her soul, pulling her closer to the edge of oblivion. But she couldn't afford to be consumed by the terror. She had already seen what happened to those who allowed the barn's power to overwhelm them. They became part of its history, trapped in its walls forever. The spirits of the dead whispered to her, warning her of what lay ahead, urging her to flee. But Elena refused to be a victim. If she was going to survive, she would have to face the darkness head-on. As she stood in the center of the barn, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices in her mind, each one urging her to give in. The pressure in the room increased, the air thickening with the weight of 1,000 unspeakable thoughts. Yet Elena held firm, her hands clenched into fists, her body taut with tension. She would fight. She had no other choice. Her eyes scanned the barn, searching for a clue, a way out of this nightmare. And then, like a flash of inspiration, she saw it. The altar, the source of the darkness, had a symbol etched into its surface, a symbol she recognized from the pages of the book. It was a seal, a ward of protection, a barrier that had been placed there long ago to keep the evil contained. But it had been weakened over time. She could feel its cracks, its faltering strength. With newfound determination, Elena approached the altar. Her heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to close in on her. She could feel the barn pressing in, the shadows closing in, but she pushed forward, knowing that she had to act quickly. If she didn't, the barn would take her as it had taken countless others. The very walls seemed to pulse with hunger, but Elena could feel the symbol calling to her, urging her to restore it, to fortify the barrier before it was too late. Her fingers brushed the surface of the altar, and for a moment, she thought she felt something move beneath her touch. It was as though the seal itself was alive, struggling to maintain its hold. With trembling hands, Elena traced the edges of the symbol, whispering the words from the book under her breath. As the final syllable left her lips, a surge of energy exploded from her fingertips, lighting up the barn in a blinding flash. The barn groaned, its very foundation shaking as the power of the symbol flared to life. The whispers died instantly, and for a fleeting moment, Elena thought she had succeeded. The darkness that had once suffocated her began to retreat, pulling away from her in fear. But then, as quickly as it had surged, the power began to flicker. The barn wasn't done yet. The darkness had not been banished. It had simply retreated, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Elena's victory was hollow, for she knew deep down that the battle was far from over. But she had gained something she could cling to, a glimmer of hope. She had found the strength to stand against the evil, to challenge the force that had held this place captive for so long. The question now was not if she would survive, but how long she could hold out before the barn's hunger consumed her completely. The barn, though still standing, had changed. It was as though Elena's desperate plea for help had stirred something deep within its walls, something that had been dormant for far too long. The air, once thick with the weight of malevolent whispers, now felt strangely empty. Yet, this silence was more unnerving than any sound. Elena could feel the absence of the power that had suffocated her moments ago, but it was the absence that left her unsettled. In a way, it made her feel more vulnerable. The darkness had receded, but she knew better than to think it was gone for good. The symbol she had etched into the altar was still glowing faintly, a beacon of resistance against the unseen forces that lurked in the corners of her mind. She watched it for a moment longer, searching for some sign that it had worked, that the ancient ward was enough to keep the evil contained. But no matter how hard she looked, the truth was undeniable. This place had never truly been purged. It was simply waiting. It had always been waiting. Elena had learned something crucial tonight, that whatever held the barn together, whatever kept it alive, could not be easily defeated. The forces in the barn had existed for centuries, and they were patient. They had all the time in the world. The question now was whether Elena had enough time to stop them before they could return in full force. The clock was ticking, and she was unsure how much longer the fragile seal would hold. She left the barn, feeling a strange sense of emptiness fill her chest. It was as though the battle had already been fought, and she had already lost. There was no real victory to claim here, no comfort to be found. Only the knowledge that the barn would never let her go. The barn, like the evil within, was a parasite, and Elena had been marked. The moonlight outside felt colder than she remembered. The oppressive weight of the barn seemed to follow her, lingering in the corners of her vision, just beyond reach. She tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the world around her, the world that was normal, the world that still offered hope. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had already crossed a threshold. There was no going back. She was now tied to the barn, forever connected to the darkness that festered within. Her mind kept returning to the book. It was still in her possession, tucked into her bag, a constant reminder of the strange power that had been unleashed. The words on its pages were no longer simply foreign symbols. They were alive, twisting and turning in her thoughts, beckoning her to return, to open it once again. But she resisted. She couldn't let it control her. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding what needed to be done. But her resistance was only half-hearted. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't simply walk away. The barn, with all its ancient evil, had become a part of her, and she could no longer ignore it. Its presence gnawed at her. Every moment a reminder that she had made a choice, perhaps the wrong one. The silence around her was unbearable now, almost suffocating. Every crack of a branch in the wind, every distant howl of a wolf seemed amplified, as if the world itself was warning her. Elena quickened her pace, desperate to leave the woods behind, to find refuge in the normalcy of her life. But no matter how fast she walked, no matter how hard she tried to outrun the darkness, it followed her. The barn would not let her go. She reached the edge of the woods, but as she crossed into the open field, the air shifted. Something was wrong. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. There, in the distance, standing tall against the horizon, was the barn. But it couldn't be. She had just left it behind. She had crossed miles to escape its grasp, and yet here it was, right in front of her, standing as though it had always been there, as though it had never moved. The barn had followed her. Somehow, it had crossed the boundary between her reality and the twisted world she had just escaped. Elena took a step back, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. She turned to look behind her, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But there was only the empty stretch of land, the same place she had just crossed. She was trapped. The barn was back, and it wasn't leaving her alone. It was then that the whispers started again, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. They began to grow louder, rising in volume until they seemed to fill the very air around her, calling her name, urging her to return, to embrace the darkness. It was too much to bear. Elena fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the force of the voices and the oppressive weight of the barn's power. This was no longer a simple haunting. This was something far worse. The barn wasn't just in her mind. It was real, and it had found a way to follow her. The ground beneath her began to tremble. The earth itself seemed to respond to the evil that had been unleashed. Elena looked up at the barn, and in that moment, she realized something she had been unwilling to accept. She was never meant to leave. The barn had always planned for her to return, and now it was going to make sure that she did. As the whispers grew louder, as the shadows began to close in, Elena understood that she had made a choice that could never be undone. The barn was no longer a distant nightmare. It was part of her reality. And no matter where she ran, no matter how far she went, the barn would always be waiting. It was time to confront the evil head-on or become a prisoner to it forever. The barn, once a symbol of fear, now appeared as an enigmatic presence that commanded Elena's every thought. Despite her attempts to walk away, to leave it in the past, it had followed her like an unshakable shadow, an undeniable force that loomed over her life. This had never been about merely escaping. This was a confrontation she had long avoided, but could no longer delay. As the barn had reappeared in her path, Elena realized that it had always been more than a building. It was a nexus of something far darker, an ancient, consuming force that demanded attention. Elena stood at the edge of the field, staring at the barn that should have been miles behind her. It loomed as an unnatural monument to her failure to break free from the twisted grip it held over her. The whispers had become a constant companion in her mind, gnawing at her thoughts, taunting her with fragments of forgotten knowledge. There was no escaping them now. As much as she wished to dismiss them, to run, the reality was inescapable. The barn had chosen her, and whether she liked it or not, she was now part of its cycle. With every passing moment, the barn seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't alive in any conventional sense, but there was something undeniably potent emanating from it, an unnatural power that defied explanation. The air had thickened. The land itself felt heavier, as if the earth beneath her feet was infused with the barn's dark will. The wind had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that clung to the world like a shroud. Elena felt like a cog in a machine, destined to play out a role she could no longer ignore. She had come this far, driven by the need to understand. But now that she was so close, Elena wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. She was afraid, not of the barn itself, but of what it represented. The harvest, the inexplicable, dark ritual that seemed to consume anyone who ventured too close to this forsaken place. The ancient forces that had been bound here for centuries were not merely interested in scaring or haunting. They were harvesting souls, drawing from the very essence of those who had the misfortune of stepping into their world. Her mind returned to the old book she had found, its pages filled with arcane symbols that made no sense, but spoke to her on an instinctual level. It was as though it had been written for her, or perhaps it had written her into its story long before she ever stumbled across it. The cryptic words filled her mind, replaying over and over, like a song she couldn't forget. The harvest must come full circle, they seemed to whisper. Elena had no idea what that meant, but she knew, deep down, that her time was running out. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, urging her forward toward the barn. She had resisted for so long, tried to defy the barn's call, but now it felt as if something far more urgent was at play. It was as though her very existence was tied to this place, as though she had been born for the express purpose of fulfilling a role in this dark and twisted cycle. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be a part of the barn's harvest, but it was too late for denial. She could no longer pretend that this wasn't happening. The barn was awake, and it was demanding its due. As she approached the entrance, Elena noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. The doors of the barn were wide open. It was as though it was inviting her inside, beckoning her to finally surrender. The ominous feeling she had tried to ignore now gripped her with a vice-like hold. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to face whatever lay beyond the threshold. But there was no choice. The whispers had become a force that she couldn't ignore any longer. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped across the threshold, her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the barn. As she moved deeper, the shadows seemed to shift and sway, as though the very walls were alive. The once familiar, decaying smell of the barn had been replaced with something far worse, an acrid stench that burned her nostrils and clawed at her throat. It felt as if the barn itself had become a breathing entity, its presence suffocating. The altar, the symbol she had etched into it, was no longer glowing. It had dimmed, faded, as though the power it had contained had been consumed. And in its place was something far worse, the harvest. She wasn't sure how she knew, but the realization hit her like a thunderclap. The barn wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, a hungry entity that fed on souls, that consumed those who entered its domain. And now, it was ready for her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she felt an overwhelming pull to the altar. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakable, a chorus of voices that seemed to seep into her very soul. She could hear them, feel them urging her to surrender, to accept her fate. The harvest must be complete, they chanted over and over. Elena felt her body move against her will, her feet taking her toward the altar as though she were no longer in control. The air around her thickened with an unnatural heat, the barn seeming to come alive with a pulse that resonated in her bones. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against her. It wasn't a physical closeness, but something far worse. The overwhelming sense that the barn was feeding on her, that every step she took brought her closer to its insatiable hunger. And in that moment, Elena understood she wasn't merely an observer of this place. She was part of its cycle. She was its next offering. The altar now stood before her, and though she knew the danger, she also knew there was no turning back. The barn had been waiting for this moment, had been waiting for her to walk into its embrace. The harvest was nearly complete. Elena, now fully aware of her role, took one final step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come full circle, and there was no escaping what was to come. The barn seemed to hum with a life of its own, its oppressive presence nearly suffocating as Elena stood before the altar. It was as if time itself had stopped, and she was suspended between the past and the inevitable future. The whispers, now a cacophony in her mind, seemed to grow louder and more insistent, a chorus of forgotten voices begging her to yield, to fulfill her role in the ritual that had been in motion for far longer than she could ever comprehend. This was not merely about her. This was something far greater, something that stretched back through the generations, a darkness that had plagued this land for centuries. The altar, now bathed in an eerie glow, seemed to beckon her with a terrible power. Its surface shimmered with strange symbols, symbols that she could now read. They were not words, but a language older than anything she had ever encountered. It was as though the very fabric of the world had been stitched together by these markings, a language designed not just to communicate, but to bind, to enslave. Elena could feel the pull of the symbols, an irresistible force urging her forward, closer to the center of the barn, closer to the heart of the darkness. Every instinct in her screamed to turn away, to leave this place and never return. But it was too late. The barn had already claimed her, and it was no longer a question of whether she could escape. This was a point of no return. The rituals, the whispers, the dark history of this place, it had all been leading to this singular moment. Elena had walked into the barn's grasp, and now it was time for the harvest to begin. She felt it in the very air around her, thick and heavy with anticipation, like a storm waiting to break. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented thoughts that had been swirling in her head since her arrival. She had read the book, deciphered its cryptic messages, and yet nothing had prepared her for the truth of what was happening here. The harvest was not just a metaphor. It was a real, tangible event that had taken place over and over again, each cycle feeding the barn, feeding the creature that lay in wait within. Elena had never fully understood the extent of the darkness until now. The barn wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a living organism, a parasitic entity that thrived on the souls of the lost, the broken, the forgotten. As her body moved against her will, drawn to the center of the room, Elena felt a deep dread rising within her. She tried to resist, but the whispers grew louder, the voices almost deafening. They spoke of sacrifice, of completion, of something older and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The barn had been waiting for her, yes, but it had been waiting for others as well. There had been many before her, many who had been drawn into the barn's insidious embrace, only to be consumed by its insatiable hunger. She stepped closer to the altar, and a coldness filled the room. It was a feeling that she couldn't explain, an unnatural cold that seeped into her skin, into her very bones. She felt her breath catch in her throat, as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe. Her hands trembled, but she could no longer stop them as they reached toward the altar, toward the strange, glowing symbols that called to her with an almost imperceptible force. In that moment, Elena understood. The barn was not a place. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far beyond the physical world. The rituals were not just meant to honor the barn's power. They were meant to open a door to something far more ancient, far more terrifying. This was no longer about fear of the barn itself. It was about fear of what lay beyond it. What had been summoned, what had been bound within these walls, was unspeakable. The altar began to vibrate, the glow intensifying as if the barn itself were waking, stretching, coming alive. Elena felt a sharp pain in her chest, as though something was being torn from her, her soul perhaps, or a piece of herself that she could never get back. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her into a void where there was no light, no sound, only the suffocating weight of an eternal emptiness. She had come for answers, but now she realized that the truth she had sought was far more horrifying than she had ever imagined. As the vibrations of the altar grew stronger, Elena could hear a low, rumbling sound coming from the very walls of the barn. The earth beneath her feet began to shake, and she realized with a terrible certainty that the barn was not just a structure. It was the vessel for something far more powerful. The ritual was not simply about the harvest. It was about awakening the creature that had slumbered for centuries, a creature that had been fed on the souls of those who had entered this place, drawn in by the whispers, by the promises of salvation. In the distance, she could hear the sound of footsteps, the faintest echo, as if the barn itself was responding to her presence. And then she understood. Elena was not alone. She had never been alone. There were others here, others who had been sacrificed, others whose souls had been absorbed by the barn, their energy feeding the entity that lay dormant beneath the earth. The whispers were not just voices. They were the voices of those who had come before, those who had been consumed by the barn's insatiable hunger. The darkness in the barn deepened, and Elena realized that she was not facing the end of her journey. She was facing the beginning of something far worse, something far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The barn was not just a place of death. It was a gateway to something otherworldly, and she was its final offering. The harvest was not complete. It had only just begun. As Elena stood in the heart of the barn, the world around her felt as if it were coming apart at the seams. The oppressive darkness that had once seemed merely atmospheric had transformed into something more tangible, more dangerous. It was no longer simply a presence, a shadow hanging over her. Now it was alive, its tendrils reaching deep into her mind, suffocating her thoughts. The whispers, which had once been mere background noise, were now a cacophony of voices that echoed within her skull. They begged, they screamed, they laughed, each voice more desperate than the last. The altar at the center of the room continued to hum, its glow intensifying. It was no longer the eerie light that had first drawn Elena in. Now, it seemed to be pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat, a dark pulse that reverberated through the very walls of the barn. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the barn itself was breathing, responding to her presence. Elena could feel the air grow colder, denser, as though she were descending into an abyss that could not be measured by any known means. The time for questions was over. The barn had already claimed her. She was part of it now, bound by forces she could not understand, forces that were older and far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered. Her heart pounded in her chest as the air grew heavier. The symbols on the altar shimmered with an unnatural light, their meanings now clear to her. Clear, but unbearable. They were ancient, a language older than humanity, a language meant to call forth the ancient entity that had slumbered beneath the barn for centuries. Elena had walked into this place searching for answers, seeking to understand the truth behind the rituals and the disappearances. But now she realized that she had found something much darker. The truth was not a comforting revelation. It was a nightmare that threatened to devour her very soul. As she stood there, caught in the thrall of the barn's malevolent energy, Elena could feel the ground beneath her feet begin to shift again. It was subtle at first, like a slight tremor, but then it grew stronger, more insistent. The barn was not just a building. It was a living entity, a monstrous thing that had been lying in wait for centuries, feeding on the souls of those who had unknowingly entered its domain. Elena was not the first to fall prey to its insidious power, and she would not be the last. But unlike the others, she had begun to understand. The barn was not merely a prison. It was a gateway, a threshold between the world of the living and something far worse. It was the entry point to a dark, otherworldly force that could not be stopped. A sharp pain shot through Elena's chest, and for a moment, she staggered, her vision going black. The ground beneath her seemed to open, the very earth splitting as though the barn itself were coming apart, revealing a hidden, more horrific truth. Beneath the floor, where the shadows had once been still, something stirred. Elena could feel it, a presence that was not of this world, not of any world that she knew. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging her to complete the ritual, to offer herself fully to the entity that was now waking from its slumber. Despite the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her, Elena fought back. She had come this far, and though she knew that the odds were stacked against her, she could not bring herself to surrender. She had to understand. She had to know what lay behind the barn's insidious rituals. The creature beneath the floor was not just an ancient evil. It was the very force that had been controlling everything, shaping the events that had led her here, orchestrating the sacrifices, the disappearances. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of choice. Would she allow herself to be consumed by the darkness? Or would she fight back, even if it meant risking everything? The altar pulsed once more, and Elena could feel the connection between herself and the entity growing stronger. It was as though the barn had begun to pull her into itself, to absorb her essence, to make her part of its eternal cycle. But as the barn closed in on her, something inside Elena snapped. In that moment of despair, of darkness, she found a sliver of clarity. The whispers were not just voices of the past. They were the voices of those who had been trapped in this place, those who had been consumed by the barn. But they were not truly gone. They were still here, still fighting to be free. Elena's eyes shot open. A new, wild energy surged through her. She was not alone in this fight. The spirits of the lost were with her, their anger, their fear, their desire for vengeance coursing through her veins. The barn may have claimed their bodies, but it had not taken their souls. The ritual, the harvest, it was a cycle, a never-ending cycle, but it was one that could be broken. The barn's power, while immense, was not absolute. Elena realized that she had the power to end it, to sever the connection between the barn and the entity beneath it. With newfound determination, Elena reached forward, her hand shaking as she touched the symbols on the altar. The moment her fingers made contact, the barn seemed to writhe, as if in pain. The pulse of its heartbeat became erratic, the walls trembling as if the barn itself were trying to shake off the burden of its long history. The whispers turned into screams, the voices of the trapped souls crying out in agony as the very fabric of the barn seemed to tear itself apart. Elena gritted her teeth, her resolve firm. She would not be a part of this eternal cycle. She would not feed the creature. She would destroy it, once and for all. The air around her grew thick, the darkness pressing in on all sides. But Elena did not falter. The altar beneath her hands began to crack, the symbols glowing brighter, then darker, as if the barn itself were fighting against her, struggling to maintain its grip on her soul. But Elena was not afraid. She had seen the truth. She had seen the creatures hold over the land, its insidious influence. And now, she was going to take it down. The barn's heartbeat was growing weaker, its presence beginning to fade as the energy from the altar pulsed with the force of her will. Elena had found the strength to reawaken something else within her, something she hadn't known was there. It was the last hope for freedom. The battle was not over. But for the first time since her arrival, Elena could see a way out, a path that might just lead her to salvation. As Elena stood over the shattered altar, the barn groaned, as though it were a dying beast expelling its final breaths. The walls were cracking, splintering, the air heavy with an oppressive, tangible presence. The dark force that had held the barn in its grip for centuries was weakening. The energy that had once surged through the space, feeding off fear and despair, was now in chaos. Elena could feel it. The power was slipping away. For the first time, the barn was no longer a force that controlled her. She had broken the cycle. But even in this moment of victory, Elena knew she wasn't done yet. The barn's pulse had slowed, but the entity beneath, the thing that had caused so much death, so much suffering, was still alive. And the darkness that had ensnared this place for so long was not going to release its hold so easily. The walls of the barn were beginning to close in, and Elena could feel its force pressing against her, pushing her toward the center where the altar had once stood. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her limbs heavy with the weight of her effort. She had fought the barn's influence, but now was fighting back. The whispers had returned, louder than before, filling the air with incoherent screams and frantic demands. The spirits of the lost souls were no longer a distant echo. They were here, pressing in on her from all sides. They were angry, and their anger was not solely directed at the barn. It was directed at her. Elena had become the symbol of their failed attempts, the person who had managed to tear through their suffering and face the entity beneath. They wanted release. They wanted to be free. But Elena knew that their release could only come if she destroyed the entity, if she severed the tie that bound them to this cursed place. Elena felt her mind begin to cloud as the darkness surrounded her once more. The ground beneath her trembled violently, and the once familiar space of the barn began to distort. The barn was no longer the barn. It was a shifting, moving entity, an extension of the dark force that had controlled it. The very nature of the space had changed, the walls now shifting like living flesh. Every surface seemed to pulse with the entity's dark presence. Elena's vision blurred, and she had to fight the urge to fall to her knees, to give in to the overwhelming sensation of being engulfed by the darkness. Her breath was shallow, her heart racing, but something deep within her refused to relent. She had come this far, and she would not let the darkness claim her now. She recalled the cryptic words that had once haunted her dreams, the words that had hinted at the key to stopping the entity. She had read them in the Book of Rituals, the ancient tome that had warned of the final binding. The ritual was not simply about destruction. It was about reversing the bond. Reversing it required an anchor, something pure, something untouched by the darkness. Elena understood now. She was the anchor. The air was thick with an energy that threatened to suffocate her, but she could no longer afford hesitation. Elena had realized that the entity, the one that had been haunting this place for centuries, could not be destroyed with mere force. The barn had been the entity's host, a place where it had fed off human misery, growing stronger with each passing generation. But the entity itself had never been fully materialized. It existed, but it existed in a form that was not bound by the laws of the living world. To banish it, Elena had to break its connection to the earth, sever its anchor to this reality. She reached for the broken altar, the once glowing symbols now cracked and dim. The ritual had begun with this altar, and it would end here as well. The symbols, though broken, were not completely gone. They still held a fragment of the ritual's power. Elena understood that she needed to restore the balance, to complete what had been started all those years ago. She took a deep breath and placed her hand over the cracked stone. At once, the barn reacted, as though the very act of touching the altar had awakened something far worse than she had expected. The walls around her trembled violently, and the entity beneath the earth howled in fury. Elena could feel it, deep within her chest, a pressure that threatened to crush her. The spirits of the lost souls screamed, but their cries were no longer words. They were unintelligible, but their rage was undeniable. The barn itself seemed to stretch toward her, its limbs, branches of rotting wood, reaching out, trying to drag her down into the depths. But Elena didn't flinch. She couldn't. There was no time for fear. The barn had fed on fear for centuries, but now Elena realized it was time to feed on something else. Hope, determination, resolve. These were the things that could break the curse. She closed her eyes, and with a final, desperate cry, she began to recite the words from the ritual, a reverse incantation, one that would undo the entity's hold. The air around her vibrated with a power she had never felt before. The walls of the barn shrieked in protest as the ritual took hold, as the energy of the reversed ritual began to tear the barn apart from the inside. The dark force that had claimed this place for so long now found itself trapped within its own prison, unable to escape the very ritual that had once bound it. Elena's voice grew louder, the words pouring out of her like a flood, the power behind them growing stronger with each syllable. The barn groaned in agony, the walls trembling as though the very bones of the earth were being crushed. Elena's body ached with the strain of the ritual, her skin burning from the energy coursing through her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The entity's power was being torn apart, piece by piece. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, and the floor gave way in places, the darkness beneath retreating, folding in on itself. The barn was falling apart, its centuries of evil unraveling before her very eyes. And then, in the midst of the chaos, it was done. The darkness began to retreat, the oppressive weight lifting from the space. The barn, no longer a living entity, seemed to exhale one final sigh. The tremors stopped, the walls ceased their groaning, and the energy in the air settled. Elena stood there, breathless, her body trembling from the exertion. But the curse had been broken. The barn, the entity, the darkness, it was all gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elena could breathe. The oppressive air had lifted, the whispers silenced. The souls of the lost, those who had been trapped for so long, had been freed. The cycle was over, and the barn's hold on this land had been broken. But Elena knew one thing for certain. She had not just defeated an ancient evil. She had faced her own demons, her own fears. And in doing so, she had freed herself and the world from the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the desolate land that had been overshadowed by darkness for so long. The once feared barn, now nothing more than a pile of rotting wood and crumbling stone, lay in ruins. Its twisted, unnatural shape had disappeared, leaving only the remnants of its cursed history. The air, which had been thick with malice and dread, now felt strangely light and free. The earth seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as if the weight of centuries of torment had finally been lifted. Elena stood amidst the wreckage, feeling the weight of what she had just accomplished, what she had overcome. She had thought the battle would end with a flash of light, with a grand release of energy or an overwhelming sense of finality. But instead, it had ended quietly. The storm had passed, and there was nothing left to do but reflect. The world had not immediately transformed, no sudden flashes of beauty or peace. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural, as if the earth itself was too stunned to react. The peace Elena felt was not one of triumph, but one of exhaustion. She had fought against a force older than time, and though the entity had been banished, there was no fanfare to mark her victory, just the stillness of a new beginning. As Elena stepped forward, her boots crunching on the dirt beneath her, she could feel a connection to the land that she had never felt before. The soil, once poisoned by the entity's presence, now seemed alive. It was as though the land itself had been reborn. The air was sweet, filled with the scent of earth and the quiet rustling of the wind through the trees. The once forgotten farm, which had become a monument to suffering, was now a place of healing, a space for renewal. But Elena knew that this peace would not come without effort. It would not be immediate. It would take time to restore what had been broken. In the distance, a small group of people had gathered. They had been the ones who had been following her, those who had seen the light even in the midst of the darkest moments. The farm had once been a place of death, but now it was a place of rebirth, a chance for the community to come together, to rebuild. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the day when the curse was broken. It had been a long journey for each of them, one that had begun long before Elena arrived, but it was now clear that this was their collective moment. Together, they would heal the wounds of the past. Elena's heart stirred as she watched them approach, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and reverence. These people had been touched by the darkness, had lived under its oppressive weight, and now they were free. They too would need to rebuild, not just the land, but their lives. Suffering had been the defining characteristic of this place, but hope would be the new foundation. It was a slow, fragile process, but it was the only way forward. The scars left by the entity could not be erased, but they could be transformed into something meaningful, a symbol of resilience. For Elena, the struggle had been personal as much as it had been external. The darkness that had consumed the barn had also consumed parts of her, taking root in her fears and regrets. She had often questioned herself, doubting whether she was strong enough to face the horrors that lay ahead. But now, standing amidst the ruins, she felt something shift within her. The fear that had plagued her for so long was no longer a constant companion. The entity had been defeated, and in its defeat, she had discovered a part of herself she never knew existed, a part that was unshakable, resilient. The final ritual had not just broken the curse, it had freed her, too. Elena turned her gaze to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. It was a new day, a day that promised renewal, even after so many years of darkness. The farm, the barn, the land, all of it had been a mirror, reflecting the deepest fears and the most painful truths. But now it was something different. Now, it was a symbol of rebirth. The land would heal, the people would heal, and the memories of the past would eventually fade, leaving behind only the lessons learned. The cycle had come to an end, but the story of this place was far from over. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The past could not be so easily forgotten, and the wounds of the land and its people would take time to mend. But Elena also knew that she had broken the most dangerous cycle of all. She had freed them from the curse. She had freed herself. The dark history of the barn, the fear, the death, they had been replaced by the seeds of something more powerful, hope. And hope, as fleeting as it might sometimes feel, had the power to transform even the most broken of places into something beautiful. As Elena walked away from the wreckage, her steps slow but purposeful, she could hear the voices of the people behind her, calling out her name. They were eager to begin, eager to reclaim what had been lost. The barn was gone, but it had left behind a legacy, not of fear and destruction, but of strength. Together they would rebuild. Together, they would write the next chapter of this place, a chapter that would not be defined by the darkness that had once claimed it, but by the light that would now guide it forward. In the distance, the barn's ruins loomed behind her, a reminder of the past that would never be fully erased, but that no longer had power over the present. Elena had faced the darkness and come out the other side. She had conquered it, not with strength alone, but with the quiet determination to face the truth to stand tall in the face of fear. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, Elena knew one thing for certain. The dawn was here, and with it, the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The barn had fallen, but from its ashes, the future would rise.